starting a mentoring program. And or what may have happened is that, you know, you may have had a program inside the organization in the past, but it was some time ago and the person that was running it is gone. So you feel like you're starting from scratch again. Or it could be a situation where you had a program in the past, but, you know, you just wanted to make sure that, you know, as you went through it, you were able to improve it because it's been a little while and everything didn't go exactly as you wanted, but, you know, you want to look at and improve it. So you kind of feel like you're starting. So this is not just for those individuals that have never had a program, but those that feel like they're beginning to start from scratch. So what I'd like to do now is to think about, you know, how you have handled mentoring in the past. So Blake, will you take us through our first poll?
I'd love to. For our first poll question, the question is simple. Does your organization have a formal mentoring program? Perhaps you're considering implementing one. Maybe you're currently implementing one. Have you had one that you didn't restart? Maybe you had one that you're restarting now. Or yes, you're currently having a formal mentoring program. Take a few minutes. Go ahead and answer that. We're at 80% of responses. I'll give that a few more seconds. Great. Let's check out these responses. 32% said, no, we are considering implementing one though. Another 32% said, not yet, but we're currently implementing a mentoring program. 8% said, we had one previously that we did not restart. Another 8% said we previously had one that we're restarting now. And the other 21% said, yes, we do have a formal mentoring program.
Okay, thank you, Blake. Yes, well, we've got a really good combination there in what we've got. So this will be really good. For those of you that have got one in place right now and you're moving forward, we hope we're going to give you some tips on making sure that, you know, anything that comes up, we can do it. For those of you that are considering doing one, you know, soon in the future or currently, and you're just getting it started, then, you know, we want to make sure we give you some solutions also. You know, one of the things that we actually do find as individuals go forward is, you know, there's going to be obstacles. You need to understand that, and these obstacles aren't always impossible. They're just, you know, there in what you're doing. The one thing you want to be sure of is, you know, don't let the fear of even starting be the obstacle that you've got. For those of you that are in learning and development or HR and have seen this before, that as you're going through and thinking about all these obstacles, and again, you know, don't add fear and then to let that be your first obstacle, is you really start out when you're doing this and, you know, you don't know what you don't know. Then what we really want to try and do today is begin to take you to you know what you don't know, and even begin to get you to you know what you know. Because your ultimate goal is to be sure that what you know is second nature, and that's going to be the implementation part. That's going to be what you're going to want to work towards. And, you know, some of the best ways to overcome some of these obstacles that you're talking about is, number one, know where the obstacles are. Know where you're at. In addition to that, avoid them when you can. And if you know where they're at, sometimes it makes it a lot easier to be able to avoid them in what you're doing. And then make sure you develop a strategy to overcome them. If you can't avoid them, and sometimes you can avoid some of it but not all of it, make sure you've got a strategy that's going to overcome them. So at this point in time, Blake, can you take us through our next poll?
Be my pleasure. For our next poll question, what do you think is your biggest obstacle to implementing a mentoring program at your organization? Are there perhaps not enough resources? Do you have trouble getting buy-in? Is it a lack of participant understanding of what's involved? Are there external pressures that are keeping you from implementing the program? Or could it be something else? And if you do answer other, would you please enter in the chat box perhaps what that other obstacle might be for us? Take a few moments to fill that out. We're at about 75% response rate. I'll give that a few more seconds before I close the poll. Great. And if you think of something after I close this, feel free to just enter it in the chat box. The results are in. 29% said just not enough resources to implement a mentoring program. 22% said they had trouble getting buy-in. A majority, 41%, said that there was a lack of participant understanding of what is entailed and involved in a mentoring program. 0% said that it was due to external pressures, and 7% gave us other. Let's see. And among those, some people say they're not sure what the benefits are, not having the right pairings, appropriate matches between mentors and mentees. Okay, Judy, what do you think?
Well, we know for sure those of you that had the other, we're actually going to be discussing those too. I really like the fact that 41% had lack of understanding of really what you want to do. We keep finding that the first one I'm going to take you through, and there was 29% on that was usually what we hear that was coming up. But this was really interesting in getting that feedback. So thank you very much in doing that. So, okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to walk you through these resources, and again, based on what we have heard from individuals, these are in order. So the first one I'm going to talk about, which is not enough resources, which was only 29% for all of you, is what we hear all the time. In fact, one of the things that we do is I go through discovery calls before we actually go too far and finding out, really what is it that you want to be able to accomplish with the mentoring program and so on and so forth. We hear this all the time. They just say, well, we really want to do this, but we just haven't got enough resources in doing that. So, a lot of times what we find that has to do with that anxiety around the lack of resources is normally due that you need to create a program. You don't know how to do it in going forward. And not only that, but you're being pushed to do it by an impossible date and in going through that. So, that all leads to a feeling that you're drowning in what you're doing in going through this because, again, remember, you don't know what you don't know, so you do feel like you're drowning. In addition to that, there seems to be some kind of a misperception, and we hear this, quite often from individuals that, they think they'll get, kind of like something from upper management. They'll say, I think we need to do a mentoring program. And they kind of feel like, well, just do it. It's no big deal. You just do it. It's just throw one together. And boy, that really can be some pressure. But of course, if it doesn't, if it's not successful, it's going to, kind of be on your head. But, all of it comes down when you don't know what you don't know. And in some cases, you're in a situation where they're asking you to create this program and do it with impossible deadlines and, these types of things. They don't know what they don't know in going through all these things. So what we're looking at, here's some solutions that we suggest in going through this. The first solution that we're talking about is make sure you've got a good solid plan. And that plan really needs to be, twofold. First of all, you need to make sure you've got a good solid process in place and you really understand exactly what you need to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And these are the kind of things that we take people through, really understanding how you roll this thing out. And so that makes sure you've got a good solid process in place. This is how you do it. Then you also need to make sure that you've got a solid methodology behind that process, which is not only saying this is what you do, but here's why you do it, and being able to move forward and in doing all these kind of things. So, again, Make sure you've got a plan that's got a process and a good solid methodology. What's the old saying that we hear all the time, that failing to plan is planning to fail in what you're doing, and we know that that happens quite often in doing that. Now, the next thing, and you had voted this one at a 22%, but usually what happens is when we have these discovery conversations, somebody says, we don't have the resources, and the next thing that comes up, really in looking at that is they're having their obstacles of getting buy-in from leadership in what they're doing. And this kind of becomes an issue as they move forward. Leaders just don't buy in. I mean, they want to make sure that nothing takes away from that bottom line, thinking that, really as you're looking into this, what's happening is this is kind of a nice to do in what you're doing, but it's not a, tying it to really an organizational strategy, which is what we feel the solution is. You need to make sure that you position mentoring as an organizational strategy. And we firmly believe that mentoring is an organizational strategy in what you're doing. Identify, exactly what of those organizational objectives that you can tie mentoring to, and then tie your objectives for the mentoring program to those organizational objectives and what you're doing. And then what you need to do is to indicate what the success metrics, that's hard to say sometimes, are going to do. The whole idea here is be proactive, not just reactive. As I mentioned, we believe that mentoring is an organizational strategy. This is not just a warm, fuzzy, feel-good program. It's a strategy, and you need to position it, as such. You need to make sure that organizations really understand that, we need to take this seriously as we move forward in what we're going to do. Now, what we see and what we have found, and this is where you had said that, that lack of understanding you thought was the highest one in going through that. And we look at that as obstacle number 3, because participants won't know what to do in going forward. And we understand that because, again, looking at, I don't know what they don't know in doing that. So what begins to happen, and we've seen this happen many times, is there's a lot of different perceptions and misperceptions around mentoring. One of the things that we talk about when I talk about mentoring is, the good news about mentoring is it's thousands of years old. The bad news about mentoring is it's thousands of years old. And the reason we say that, if you put 25 people in a room, you could come up with, 8 to 10 different perceptions regarding what a mentor is, what a mentee is, and, what mentoring is overall in what you're doing. So, you've got to make sure that you get rid of all those misperceptions with some guidance for your mentors, your mentees, and all the participants in doing that. Because what happens is you start putting misconceptions around no guidance, and all of a sudden you end up with, some floundering mentors and mentees, and actually some floundering managers in what you're doing and how you're moving forward. So you really have got to get everybody on the same page, and then what you've got to do is make sure that the sum of misperception and no guidance doesn't lead to the floundering mentors and mentees in what you're going to do. And, the best way that we suggest you do that is you're taking it forward is communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate at all times. And make sure there's a consistency. And just as I just said, make sure, get rid of those misperceptions. Make sure everybody's on the same page in what they're doing. And do that from the very beginning of when you are even talking about your mentoring program and starting to, position it within the organization. Make sure everybody starts on the same page, because it's a whole lot easier to do that than it is to roll everything out and then try and get everybody back and get them restarted on what they're doing. And then not only that, but make sure that as your program is being implemented and it's rolling out, you do some spot checking. And make sure everybody still is on the same page. One of the things that we see happen many times is that program administrators or individuals will roll out a mentoring program and then they think it's okay. And they don't go back and check to see if everybody's still on the same page, everybody's, still consistent in the way they think. what will happen is, there just might be somebody that joined the program that maybe didn't go through some of the training or wasn't there for the initial kickoff or whatever it might be, and suddenly they come in and they've got some different ideas in what they're doing, and they start to, kind of bring those ideas to everybody else. In addition to that, what can happen is if the mentor or the mentee is having some problems in the mentoring partnership, or they're not quite understanding something, they'll go back to those old misunderstandings and misperceptions they had. And so you really need to do some spot checks, and I do my first one, your first spot check, somewhere around 6 to 8 weeks after you kick off your program and get going, because if you've got any of those misperceptions, again, get that consistency in there and get everybody on the same page at the same time, because you want to catch it as soon as possible. Because remember, they don't know what they don't know. And again, lack of understanding, you all said 41%. They don't know what they don't know, and doing that. That really leads into the fourth obstacle that we talk about, which has to do with some misperceptions around mentoring. And we really just began, talking about some of those and about the definitions of what a mentor is or a mentee is, and so on and so forth. Some of the prime misperceptions that we see that come up are, number one, guess what? I can't work this into my schedule. It's a time commitment, and I can tell you the number one idea that comes up every time when you talk to somebody about being a mentor or mentee is, I'd love to do it, but I haven't got the time. I'd love to do it. I'd love to be a mentor. I haven't got the time. I'd love to be a mentee, but I haven't got the time. And time is that big issue that always comes up. And it also is based on a very big historical misperception around mentoring, that if I decide, especially for a mentor, if I decide to be a mentor in this partnership, I mean, this is a lifetime commitment. And what we're saying is, no, it's not. We're asking you for a commitment of 8, 10, 12 months, and so many hours, maybe a month. But you've got to get through some of these misperceptions around even the time commitment of what they're doing. Another misconception we hear is the perception that mentoring has little or no value for my career, personal life, and what you're doing. And we're thinking, that's kind of interesting, because mentoring isn't only for this long-term career development. There's always a misperception historically that it's only for those individuals that want to get promoted and do those types of things. And the fact that guess what? This really can help you in skills. It can help you with understanding the culture of the organization. Mentoring can help you understand a lot of the different ways in which you want to be able to look at different positions, and are you qualified for those positions, and being able to do those kind of things. So, if you're improving your career and your business life, you're probably automatically improving your personal life. In fact, one of the things that we find many times is some of the mentoring that will come out is around what we call work-life balance, and that definitely has value to the career personal life in doing that. And then perception that, guess what, it's not an organizational or business strategy. And going back to that, if I've got a choice to work on something around business, or I've got a choice to meet with my mentor, guess what I feel like I need to do first? I got to concentrate on the business. And really getting people to understand that, no, if you're working with a mentor or a mentee and what you're doing, you're working on business, because it's already been positioned as an organizational strategy in doing that. So, it's almost like, you can spend the time because you're working on business. It definitely has value because you're working on business, and then it definitely is tied into the organizational strategy of everything that you're doing. So here's some solutions that we believe are important around going through this about these misconceptions around mentoring. And what you really need to do is make sure you're setting expectations in the beginning. It's a little bit about similar to what we talked about when we mentioned that individuals don't know exactly what their roles are in doing that. But you've got to start at the beginning. And we suggest you start with that strategic planning workshop that we talk about. And again, that helps you to really identify the organizational objectives. that you want to work towards. Not just something, like saying, well, we want to develop our people better. It's a nice wish, but it's not necessarily an organizational strategic objective in what you're doing. So we really work to help you identify those. In addition to that, looking at how you're going to measure success. And again, a lot of times individuals don't think in terms of actually measuring success in what they're doing. They think in terms only in having to do with, we really hope that everybody likes it in what they're doing. But we believe there's really two kinds of measurement that you're going to be going through. One is qualitative, and that is about how people feel. Did they like the program? They feel they got something out of it. Were they happy with the mentor or mentee they were matched with? Those kinds of things. But again, what you've got to look at is you have got to look at the quantitative. Exactly how can you measure the return on investment on your mentoring program and what you're doing? One of the questions that always comes up in the webinars as we're doing it is how can you measure mentoring? Or what is the most common way that people measure mentoring? And I can tell you that the two most common ways that organizations will measure mentoring is, number one, they have been able to shorten the learning curve in what they're doing. We had one organization, and they knew that when somebody entered a certain position, and they could be in, it could be somebody new from the outside or somebody internal, but it was a new position. And when somebody entered that position, it took approximately 18 months to get them totally up to speed. So, they were going to spend 18 months in getting this individual really ready to move forward and do what they needed to do. Well, we were able, through mentoring, to reduce that 18 months to 13 months. Now, that 5 months difference is a big difference and something you really can measure. The other thing that we found with organizations in looking at a way to measure mentoring has to do with the fact that organizations have realized that individuals could get the development that they needed through a mentoring partnership versus having to go to a training class. And we actually did previously, a couple of months ago, a very specific webinar, and we compared training costs to either substituting mentoring for training or supplementing your training with mentoring and doing that, and substantial savings that you'll come through. The second thing we believe you do, and it definitely gets rid of the misperceptions around mentoring, as well as people not understanding, that lack of understanding with the role, is you need to have role profiles. You need to have role profiles for your mentors, your mentees, and you also need to have some idea that you set up for your managers. Don't leave your managers out of this as you're going through. Make sure that they understand how they fit in to this mentoring partnership between the mentor and mentee. It's interesting, you wouldn't ask anybody to take on a role or a job or anything else if they didn't have some kind of a job description and didn't understand the skills that it took to do it and weren't qualified to do that. So without a role profile, people are kind of, floundering, going back to what we had talked about before, that, they've got no guidance and they're making up their own rules as they go along and their own perceptions. So, you need to have very specific role profiles in what you're doing so that people understand what they need to be doing in a mentoring partnership and the skills that are required to do so. And then you need to provide training. One of the things many times we hear is that organizations really don't understand how important it is to train mentors and mentees. They feel like if they just give them a kickoff session and hand them a booklet, that they'll be fine. And guess what doesn't get read? We're all busy, and those booklets many times don't get read. But the other reason you want to do training is, again, you wouldn't ask anybody to go into a new role they weren't quite sure of if you didn't provide them with training and guidance in what you were doing. So you need to make sure that everybody gets training. The mentors, the mentees, and once again, don't forget the managers. They need to understand what they should be doing. They need to understand what their role is in this mentor-mentee partnership as they're going forward. And, many times, what we find in doing that is that the managers will say, organization says I need to support this program, and the organization says I need to support these partnerships. But I'm not real sure what, quote, support looks like in going through this process. So don't leave your managers out. Make sure you train them also in doing that. Now, the last one that we want to cover is around, external pressures that come up in doing that. And many times, getting your mentoring program going and getting it started is affected by these external pressures. One of those could be the economy. The economy's rough and things aren't going well, so, that's affects you getting started in your mentoring program. Or it could be budget cuts, which sometimes is affected by the economy, but budget cuts within the organization in what you're doing. And that could be affecting it. Or maybe there were some organizational issues that you've just gone through. You've done a reorganization. You were just acquired by another company. You acquired another company. All these types of things that go on, and it's all these issues that go on. But part of what we talk about is that when these types of situations exist, you need to make sure, this is when you need mentoring the most of all these things, and you need to make sure you're able to track and report and measure your mentoring program. Especially if you've got budget cuts or the economy is affecting your organization and sales maybe aren't going as well or whatever, this is when you need development. You don't want to just stop developing all your people in hopes that somehow they'll get it in doing that. And we all know, all of us that have ever been in anything that had to do with training, L&D, or anything else, know that when it comes to budget cuts, the first thing to go is training and development in doing that. And not just training, but overall development. And I'm telling you, mentoring is the answer. During these really tough times, that's when you want your best, your brightest, and your most talented people working to keep the organization on track. And the thing that's wonderful about mentoring is one of the most cost-effective and time-efficient tools you have within your organization to develop your people. This is part of what you've got. You're using your internal talent. So use those internal resources that you've got. This will allow you then to ensure that leadership and management will take the program seriously. If you're going to go back and you're going to tie it to organizational objectives, show your measurements and how cost effective it is, that begins to ensure that leadership and management take the program seriously in what they're doing. Also, if you're tracking, reporting, and measuring, you're proving your success. And again, we're looking at that success in terms of the qualitative and the quantitative in what you're doing. So, you're also looking at that return on investment. And then don't always assume everything is going to be wonderful. Don't report to everybody that there are absolutely no problems in what you're doing. There probably is some areas where you could improve, and so don't try and gloss over this, but be honest. Even if it's these 9 things are going well, but we really want to work on this number 10 and being able to do that. So be honest in tracking and reporting, and then that's going to keep your program from being cut. But make sure that you're tracking all through. Make sure you're providing reports to those individuals that need it. And then all of that is going to allow you to measurement and keep your program from being cut. So again, these 5 areas or 5 obstacles that we come across, we know that some of you have actually hit some of those, whether you're beginning or kind of revamping your program as you went forward. But it's real important to understand that, number 1, don't let your first obstacle be fear. And then all of the other obstacles that we've talked about, there really are solutions. And the solutions are fairly easy to implement if you know what you're doing. Because we're now beginning to take you then to that point of, now you know what you don't know, and we want you to progress till you know what you know as you're going forward. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take you through a couple of case studies in which organizations they've gone through some of these obstacles and they've seen what happens. They've actually lived them. Now, the first one that we're going to walk you through is a situation where somebody had some obstacles that they went through, but they ended up doing more stumbling than anything else in what they were doing. Here's what happens. Their situation was that they found they were putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into the development of new hire engineers, and that was part of their problem. Those new hires got bored because it was a very, very long program of what they were doing. There really wasn't any way for the engineers that were going through it to speed up the process. Everybody had to go through the very same steps in doing that. And some people didn't need all of that. But, you know, it was kind of stuck there, and so they got bored, and unfortunately what happened is they would end up leaving. Turnover rate was really, really high in this organization, what they were doing. What really happened is they were doing some real backwards planning and doing this, and really looking at a lot of obstacles going forward. Another obstacle that came up for them was that the HR function was under pressure to get some mentoring software in place before the end of the year. And this was in September that we were even starting around this. So they were under a lot of pressure. Don't care what you do, just got to have some technology to manage all this and going forward. Now, in addition to that, another really hard stumbling block that they had was the mentors were forced to be mentors. So you had individuals that were forced to be in that role and what they were doing, and it's not a role they wanted to be in, but they didn't have a whole lot of choice. So what ended up happening is that, you know, the mentors didn't want to be in that role, and the mentees, I'm sure, probably knew that. And whenever you force a human being, or all like that to do something they don't want to do, you know, they'll figure out some way to get around it in not wanting to do it. In addition to that, the mentors and mentees were matched inefficiently by hand. Because the numbers were so large in what they were doing, you know, you can imagine that, you know, probably the first, you know, 10, 15, 20, 25 matches were very thought through and thoughtful in what they were doing, and then that began to, you know, flounder, and so the last ones didn't match very effectively. There was an informational program in place, but there really wasn't any training. It was more like a kickoff program, but no real training that they were doing. So those are some of the people obstacles they had. Now, from a process standpoint, the obstacles they had was, you know, they did have a strategic planning meeting, but it was way after the program had started. So what they were finding out is all the things they should have done differently, but it was almost impossible to go back and fill all the gaps that they finally realized did exist. It's a little bit about the difference between ready, fire, aim, and ready, aim, fire. Well, they did the ready, fire, aim first in doing that. Now, in addition to that, and thinking about that process, there really wasn't any accountable program administrator. No one was doing that tracking and reporting and measurement. There was no spot checking going on that we talked about to make sure, you know, things are, you know, going to stay on place. There was somebody that people could call up and talk to, but this person really didn't want to be in the program in the first place, so, you know, really nobody was kind of using it as they went through. And then the other thing that began to happen is because there was such a emphasis on the technology, there were so many changes that were going on in the technology that, you know, it was getting to the point they were making changes, but nobody was using it and doing that. So the results were the program never was really fully implemented in doing that. And because of that, no one, you know, felt they were getting any development or that any progress had been made. I mean, you know, the way they did it, it was just one obstacle after another. Now, here's another case study. And they had some obstacles because, again, it's going to happen in doing that, but they turned those into opportunities in what they were doing. And, you know, they had a desire to change. They had a current software vendor at that time, and they needed to change. That was one of the issues they had. Also, the then current software vendor did not provide training for them in doing that, and it was important to them as they were making this transition from one vendor to another. They wanted to make this as seamless as possible because a lot of the individuals that were involved as mentors in this program were fairly senior levels, and they just want to say, look, we just need to make this as smooth and seamless as possible as we go through. So, you know, how do we make sure we get over that obstacle? Now, the objective of the program was around general leadership development and what they were doing and looking at that. So here's what we did with them, thinking in terms of, their process, their people, and their technology in doing this. First of all, we had a mini strategic planning workshop with them to evaluate, because they had some good things going on, but they needed to find out where those gaps were in that present process and in what we were doing. And then what was happening is we delivered training for the mentors and the mentees in what we were doing, and that gave them an idea of, this is my role. They had role profiles, and they were able to qualify mentors, so not everybody was considered a mentor, but they were able to qualify, which made sure they had good mentors. And then, of course, they had the technology. And when we took them through training, what we really did was to help them understand how the technology was not a separate outside tool, but how it really enhanced the partnership. So that was for the mentors and mentees, and then for the administrators, it ensured tracking and measuring capabilities and being able to take this through. The results were actually they had gone through their first phase. They're actually in phase 2, their first rerun of the mentoring program. They got good feedback from the managers that they really like the program. It's gotten positive word of mouth within the organization. There's an increased number of applications for both mentors and mentees in doing this. So when several phases ago, they were just pulling to get mentors and mentees to be a part of the program. This time what was happening is you had a lot of mentees from that first phase that wanted to be mentors, mentors that wanted to be mentors again, and new applications for individuals. In fact, they actually had to turn some individuals that wanted to be mentors down because of the size of the program. And then what also happened was they had mentees that moved into more complex job roles within the organization. Now, we didn't say they were promoted in doing that, because we want to make it clear we don't believe that mentoring is totally about promotion. But they did move, they got different development, and so many of them were able to move into more complex job roles and more complex projects in what they were doing. Here's a couple of quotes that I thought were really, really great, because you talk about that fear-free approach for everybody, and we've been talking more about how you put your program together, but look at some of these. This really was a fear-free approach for the mentors and mentees as they were going through. These are direct quotes. It was helpful to have a formalized way to match with a mentor rather than just, kind of pursue them informally and doing that. I appreciated having a safe environment to openly discuss my developmental areas and bounce potential approaches for changes in the way I work. And that was because of the role profiles and the training. So it was not only a fear-free approach for the administrators, but also for the participants, the mentors and the mentees, to take that forward. So now we've gone from you don't know what you don't know. We hope we've taken you to you know what you don't know. And now it's time to act on that knowledge and do something about it. So at this point in time, Blake, will you take us through our next poll, please?
I'd love to. For our final poll question, given what Judy's just discussed about knowing what we do or do not know, where do you feel you are on this continuum? Are you aware of knowledge gaps but don't know what they are? Do you know where your knowledge gaps are and are working on them? Have you filled in the knowledge gaps about mentoring that you previously had? Or maybe what you know about mentoring is already second nature. Okay, I'll give that a few more seconds. Great, let's see the results. 8% say they know they have knowledge gaps but don't know what they are. Almost 60% say they know where their knowledge gaps are and they're working on them. 24% say they filled in those knowledge gaps, and 8% say it's already second nature. What do you think, Judy?
I think that's great, and good for all of you where it's become second nature. You've overcome some of those obstacles, but that biggest percentage of 60% where, you begin to find out, what it is you don't know. And that's, really, that's a big thing, and that's where we wanted to try and help you with today and some of those solutions. And, kind of a final thought as we're going through this is, this is how we can help you as you go through that. First of all, we can help you with this strategic planning workshop that I had talked about, and really making sure you've got a good, solid process and methodology before you roll out your mentoring initiative, so that you don't have to go back and redo it again in doing that. And then again, we can offer training with, helping you to train your mentors, your mentees, your managers, and role profiles to really help everybody understand what they need to be able to do. And then we can help you again with that rollout, so that you really understand as you go through the strategic planning process, and we get to step number 7 in that process, it very easily says, this is what you do in step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and so on. So some best practices that we're going to tell you just as you go through, kind of some free advice here. Keep your program small when you're first rolling it out. You want to make sure that you can get your arms around it. Depending on the size of your organization, that could mean that you're starting out with 25 pairs, or you're starting out with 200 pairs as you're doing that. But depending on the size of your organization and its proportion, that could be up. But keep the program small. Evaluate what you're going to need to manage your data. Who needs to know what? Why do they need to know it? And how you're going to get them the information that they need. And then ensure that you've accounted for all of the necessary elements, so that your program can be absolutely successful. So think all these things through before you start out. So remember, don't let the fear of the obstacles be your number one obstacles in what you're doing. Don't let that start you out to where you don't get going. Acknowledge you don't know what you don't know, and I think that's great that when we were talking about the individuals in doing that. Either you don't know what you don't know, or you don't know how to overcome some of those things. Determine what your obstacles are, put them in a plan and a process and some way to overcome them, and start with a small phase 1. Notice I didn't say pilot. I said a small phase 1 of your mentoring program. And the reason we talk about the fact that you need to call it a phase 1 instead of a pilot is sometimes there is some kickback from individuals that aren't a part of that pilot, thinking that it's not really fair. In addition to that, sometimes you don't put as much effort into a pilot as you do in other programs, so we suggest you call it phase 1, because that makes it more permanent and it's positioned more permanently with your organization. And also because for those individuals not chosen to participate, that what you've got there is the ability to let them know there's going to be a phase 2. So at this point in time, Blake, will you take us through some of those questions?
Sure, you just mentioned some best practices. We're curious, what are some best practices for creating role profiles for mentors and mentees?
Okay. It's just like thinking in terms of a job description. What do you want that individual to be able to do? And you've got to take it outside of what they will be developing in the individual, or what they were doing, but the fact that they are going to be developing. When we talk about the definition of a mentor, we're talking about an individual who's got knowledge or experience in a given area of expertise, who's willing and able to share that knowledge and expertise. Now, the two most important words in that definition are willing. They're going to make the commitment, and they're going to commit to that mentee with their development. They're going to put a plan together with them. They are going to make sure there's scheduled time that they're going to, meet with that mentee. All of these types of things that they're going to be able to do. So it's that commitment level. In addition to that, you need to make sure that they have the skills to be a mentor in doing that they've got the relationship building skills, they've got the communication skills, they've got the interpersonal skills, they've got the listening skills, all those things that you need to be a mentor. The hardest thing about coming up with a role profile for a mentor and a mentee is basically you keep thinking in terms of what they do in their job and trying to do that, and you need to separate that out. Think as if the only job in the entire world that they had was to be a mentor. What would you want them to accomplish, and what skills would they have to be able to do that? So think in those terms. Do we have another question?
Yes, we had actually discussed that not everyone is ready to be a mentor. How do you identify who is well suited to be a mentor?
We suggest that you take them through some kind of an assessment. Find out, we just said that willing and able was the most important criteria in that definition of being a mentor. So what would a commitment level look like? Do you want them to be ready to meet with somebody, 3 hours a month, 2 hours a month, 4 hours a month, 1 hour a month? What do you want? Take them through and make sure that everybody understands what you're expecting of them, and then assess if they can do it in doing that. Also assess their skills. What are their relationship building skills? What are their interpersonal skills? What are their coaching skills? What are their communication skills? These are all very important, and if you don't have those kinds of definitions internally, it's something we certainly can help you with, but you need to assess if they've got those skills to be able to do it. So it goes with the first question: make sure they understand what's expected of them from a responsibility level and a skill level, and then answering this question is the next piece on, which is assess. They're going to do it.
Great. Now, speaking of matching criteria, what are some of the best practices for establishing matching criteria?
All goes back to the beginning. All goes back to the very first thing, which is what are your goals and objectives for the mentoring program, and how is that tied to your organizational objectives? So as an example, if your mentoring program is going to focus on leadership development and that's tied to your organizational objectives, in doing that, then your matching criteria is going to be around those types of issues. It's going to be around those specific skills or competency areas or knowledge areas that have to do with leadership development. So every time it goes back to the beginning. I have been recently working with an organization, and they're very specifically concentrating on engineers in what they're doing. Well, it went specifically to those skills that are specific to the new engineer coming into the organization, and so that was their criteria. So when it talks about coming up with your matching and pairing criteria, it always goes back to what organizational objectives are you tying this to, what are your objectives of your mentoring program, and how are you going to measure it.
Great, thanks. Now, in terms of program administration, do you typically see patterns in how certain tasks are delegated? Do you have a single program administrator who's in charge of reporting and mentor matching and so on, or is it usually best, do you think, or does it depend on the organization to have it split out across different responsibilities, different roles?
It really depends on how big your program is, how big your organization is, and are you using technology? One of the things I'd said in the beginning is how wonderful technology can be to keep your program from becoming an administration nightmare in what you're doing. If you're only doing this with Excel spreadsheets and you've only got 25 pairs, chances are one person can administer that program. We work with organizations all over the world in which there's, they've got a lot of different mentoring programs that are running, and so normally what you have is a program administrator. You've got one for the diversity program, one for the leadership development program, one for the high potentials program in doing that, and so there's a program administrator for each of those in being able to do that. I would say what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a situation where individuals are managing more than one program, reporting more than one program. Let them concentrate on one specific area.
Great. Now, in terms of technology, what do you recommend for a mentoring program?
That's fairly easy. We have a technology program, and that's what we recommend. And let me tell you what makes our technology a little different from a lot of other technology you might come across. Many times we have found that with some organizations, the technology program was created, and then they created a methodology and a process to match then the technology. And what we did is we had a good solid process and methodology that's been in place for over 23 years, and what we did then was to create the technology that supported the methodology and the process. So you've got your ability to match and pair. That's based on your organizational criteria. You've got the ability to track. It's tied to organizational objectives. So all the things you want to be able to do is tied back to that methodology.
Thanks so much, Judy. It looks like we're about out of time. So thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. If you'd like a copy of today's slideshow or a recording of today's webinar, you can find the links to both on our Mentoring Thought Leaders group page on LinkedIn. We'll also post answers to any other popular questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please feel free to email us at info@ensala.com. We very much value your feedback on our webinars. Judy, any other comments before we sign off?
No, I'd just like to add my thanks in for your participation and some really great questions. And again, if there is any other questions that we can provide information, please go into Ensala, info@ensala.com. Also would like to tell you we've got a website that is totally devoted to mentoring at mentoringtalent.com. So many, many resources there. But thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Have a great day.